The thing about genius is that it rarely looks how people expect. There are no dramatic violin soundtracks when it walks into a room, no flashes of lightning in the background, and certainly no crowds gathering to applaud a breakthrough. Most of the time, genius looks like someone squinting at a chipped mug for far too long, trying to remember whether they left the tea bag in or already fished it out. This is more or less the kind of genius you're meeting now. His name is Elias Varr. He is not famous, not yet, and perhaps not ever, unless you count the fact that the postman remembers him as the fellow with all the graph paper, and the grocer knows he always buys exactly 3 apples, never more, never less. Elias is a man whose life is stitched together from small routines, and it is inside those routines that his mind wanders off to places so strange and so deep that most of us would need a packed lunch just to follow along. It begins with the sound of wood remembering it has opinions. The front door, which faces the narrow street and takes the brunt of every winter gale, is not so much broken as it is stubborn. Every morning, it resists. The frame has shifted over years of salt-heavy wind, so the door fits into it like a puzzle piece that was forced in, and then refused to come back out. Elias knows this. He has known it for the better part of a decade, which is why he leans into it with his shoulder, feeling the grain of the wood pressing faintly through the worn fabric of his cardigan. There's no hurry in the push. He lets the moment stretch. The way the wood creaks, the way the latch hesitates before it clicks, the way the faint scent of the outside air starts to leak in before the door has even properly opened. When it does, the first breath is always the same, cool, salted, faintly metallic, as though the sea itself has dissolved into the air. It smells of wet stone, of old rope, of distant fish markets that haven't opened yet. Elias stands there for a moment longer than necessary, because mornings like this have no reason to be rushed. He pulls the door shut again, the same stubborn sigh in reverse, and turns back into the hallway. The light here is dim and slow-moving, sliding through the lace curtain at the far end, like someone who has arrived too early for a meeting and is trying not to draw attention to themselves. It falls on the floorboards, which are cool under his slippers, and carry the soft, uneven groans of wood that has been walked on by exactly one man for far too many years. The hallway is lined with shelves, not neat, matching shelves, but a mismatched family of them. Tall ones, short ones, ones that lean slightly to the left as though they've had a long day. They're filled with books that don't quite stand upright. Some lean on each other for support. Some tilt forward like they've given up entirely. The air smells faintly of them, dry, a little dusty, but warm in a way that makes the whole place feel like it's been thinking quietly to itself for decades. Elias moves toward the kitchen at the far end. The kettle sits where it always does, on the far right of the counter, a little limescale stain forming a faint ring around its base. The mugs hang from hooks above it, not because he likes the look, but because once he put them in a cupboard and forgot where they were for a week. He chooses one mug without looking, the chipped white one with a fading pattern of blue circles around the rim. He fills the kettle slowly, the sound of water glugging against metal filling the small space in a way that feels louder than it really is. When he sets it on to boil, the first faint hiss rises into the air like a polite request for attention. It will be 5 minutes before the water is ready. Elias knows this exactly. 5 minutes in which he will stand by the counter, staring absently at the little corkboard above it. On the corkboard are scraps of paper with numbers, equations, and the occasional small drawing of a circle. Nothing labeled, nothing dated. They have been there so long that the paper edges have curled slightly, as though trying to roll away from the pushpins. Somewhere in all these scraps is the outline of something Elias believes will matter. Something that could, in his more hopeful moments, change the way the world thinks about something. But for now there is only the kettle, and the faint hum of the fridge, and the way the morning light slides along the counter like it's in no hurry to go anywhere else. The kettle clicks itself into silence with the soft, matter-of-fact finality of something that has done its job and would now like to be left alone. Steam curls upward in slow, transparent ribbons, fading into the still air of the kitchen, as though shy about drawing too much attention. Elias reaches for the jar of tea leaves on the second shelf. It is always on the second shelf, directly between the jar of sugar and the jar of something that may have been dried oregano in the late 1990s, but has since evolved into a greenish-brown mystery. The tea jar's lid is slightly stiff, not enough to be frustrating, but enough to require a moment of deliberate twisting. When it comes loose, it gives a tiny pop, releasing the faint earthy smell of the leaves. He spoons them into the mug with a care that feels almost ceremonial. 1, 2. Each spoonful slides into the chipped white mug with a faint, dry whisper. He doesn't count out of necessity. The ratio is already etched into his muscles. But because the counting makes the process feel anchored, unhurried, resistant to the kind of rushed efficiency the world seems to prize far too highly these days. The boiling water hits the leaves with a muted hiss. There is a brief, swirling bloom of brown in the clear water, like smoke unfurling in reverse. Elias stirs it slowly, once clockwise, then once counterclockwise, not because he has found any measurable difference between the two directions, but because it feels balanced. He leaves the spoon in the sink, where it makes a small metallic sound against the porcelain. Tea in hand, he moves to the small table by the window. It is not so much a breakfast table as it is a surface for catching loose papers, the occasional letter, and the one plant he has somehow managed not to kill. The plant, a slow-growing, vaguely unbothered thing in a faded terracotta pot, leans fractionally toward the window as if trying to overhear whatever the street outside might be saying. The view from this window is not remarkable. A narrow street, 2 parked cars, a row of houses that look as though they were built with the shared ambition of being unmemorable. But the window also frames a sliver of sky, and on mornings like this, the sky is layered with the palest, most reluctant blue, the sort of blue that looks as though it might change its mind at any moment and go back to gray. Elias sips the tea while the steam still ghosts up past his face. It is too hot, of course, but he does not mind. The warmth fills the inside of his mouth, travels slowly down his throat, and seems to expand into the quiet of the kitchen. There is something almost mathematical about it. The way the heat diffuses, the way it can be charted from the moment it touches his lips to the way it settles somewhere deep and steady in his chest. On the table there is a notebook. It is spiral-bound, its cover worn soft at the edges, and it contains nothing remotely like a diary. Instead, every page is covered in sketches of shapes, fragments of equations, and diagrams that wander off into the margins like they are taking a casual walk. Circles appear again and again, sometimes perfect, sometimes imperfect, as though testing what perfection even means. Elias opens it to the most recent page. The last thing he drew was a cluster of concentric circles, the kind that look like ripples frozen in time. Around them are scattered numbers and symbols that only Elias understands, and even then, only in moments of particular clarity. He sets his mug down, its base making a faint, damp ring on the tabletop, and leans in over the page. Outside, a distant gull cries, its voice stretching out into the morning air. A bicycle rolls past, the faint whir of its tires mingling with the sound of the tea cooling in the mug. Time here is not marked by clocks, but by these small, inconsequential sounds, the sort of moments that, taken together, form the true fabric of a morning. And in the middle of it all sits Elias Varr, pencil in hand, circling something in the margin, as though the answer might be hiding there, waiting patiently to be noticed. The pencil rolls slowly between Elias's fingers, a small, unconscious rotation, the kind people do when they are not really thinking about the pencil at all. The wood is smooth from years of being handled but never chewed, and the lead is worn to the sort of bluntness that suggests quiet, measured use, rather than hurried scribbling. He leans back slightly in the chair. It creaks, of course, the same creak every morning, right where the wood meets the frame. Some people would find that irritating. Elias, however, finds it almost reassuring, the sort of noise that belongs to the rhythm of the house, like the ticking of an old clock, or the faint hum of a refrigerator that's been running without interruption since at least the late 1980s. His gaze drifts again to the street outside. It has not changed. It never does. The same cars, the same pavement, the same slightly uneven curb that dips as though bending under the weight of years. A cat appears from behind one of the cars. Not a graceful, cinematic cat, but one of those broad-shouldered street cats that moves with the weary, measured confidence of someone who knows every warm patch of concrete in the neighborhood. The cat pauses halfway across the road, sits, and begins cleaning a paw, with the sort of seriousness other creatures reserve for actual work. Elias watches, because it seems important to give the moment his full attention. The cat finishes, looks around as if to check whether anyone noticed, and then carries on toward the low brick wall at the far end of the street. The tea, now cool enough to drink without hesitation, tastes deeper than before, as though the leaves have had time to fully persuade the water to become something else. Elias takes another sip, then sets the mug down again, perfectly aligning it with the edge of the damp ring it left earlier. The repetition pleases him. The notebook waits patiently on the table, but Elias does not rush to return to it. Instead, he lets his eyes follow the slow shifting of light across the wall opposite the window. The sun is climbing, though you wouldn't know it by its enthusiasm. The light spreads in soft, diluted layers, barely stronger than it was an hour ago. Shadows lean lazily toward the east, stretching a fraction longer before they decide to start shrinking again. In the kitchen, the air has settled into that mid-morning stillness, where even dust motes seem reluctant to move. The only sound is the faint, distant rhythm of someone walking somewhere down the street. A muted double thud of footsteps that fade before they can be properly noticed. Elias picks up the pencil again, draws a single line, then stops. The line does not lead anywhere, it simply exists, clean and unbroken. He sets the pencil down. This too feels right. Some mornings progress is measured not by how much is done, but by how comfortably little needs to be done at all. And so the day stretches onward. Slow, undemanding, and perfectly willing to remain exactly as it is for a while longer. Elias sits there, hands loosely around the cooling mug, watching as nothing in particular happens in the gentlest, most deliberate way possible. Elias stands in the doorway of the room he calls his laboratory. It is not, strictly speaking, a laboratory in the sense most people would imagine. There are no gleaming metal benches, no expensive equipment arranged with sterile precision, no white walls bathed in bright clinical light. Instead, there is a single desk pushed up against the far wall, a scattering of papers that seem to have settled where gravity dictated rather than where intention placed them, and a small collection of tools and objects that might puzzle a visitor who was not already inside Elias's head. He takes a slow step inside. The air is cooler here, partly because the single window is always cracked open just enough to let in a steady trickle of outside air, and partly because the room itself is simply not in a hurry to warm up. On the desk sits an arrangement of things that could be prototypes, or could be pieces of something still waiting to be born. A copper coil leans against a glass jar. 3 screws rest in a neat triangle on the edge of a notebook. A magnifying lens lies face down, as though it gave up looking closely at anything last night and has been resting ever since. Elias runs a hand along the edge of the desk. It is slightly rough. The kind of roughness that catches the skin just enough to remind you that the wood is still wood, not the smooth imitation of it you get in flat-packed furniture. He likes this. It feels honest. The chair, the same creaky one from the kitchen, temporarily borrowed, is pulled out just far enough to invite him to sit. But he doesn't. Not yet. Sitting implies beginning, and beginning requires a certain level of readiness he isn't quite certain he has this morning. Instead, he stands, looking at the space as though it might reveal something new if he waits long enough. A beam of light slants in through the open window, catching on the glass jar, and scattering faint reflections across the wall. Dust particles drift in it like lazy constellations. He imagines, briefly, that someone might walk in now and see this tableau, the light, the dust, the quiet, him standing there, and assume he is deep in thought about the physics of light diffraction. In reality, he is thinking about whether he remembered to put the milk back in the fridge. The silence here is different from the silence in the kitchen. In the kitchen, silence is domestic. The hum of the fridge. The occasional shifting tick of a cooling kettle. Here, it is more intent. Stillness that seems to wait for him to act. But Elias, as ever, is in no rush. Physics may be about motion and energy, but his own method is about the precise opposite. Waiting until even the air feels ready to move with him. Elias finally sits. It is not a decisive, time to get to work sort of sitting. It's more of a careful lowering, the way you might sink into an old armchair when you're not entirely sure if it will creak, groan, or outright collapse under you. His chair offers only a single mild protest, a long, drawn-out creak that sounds like the floorboards upstairs when his neighbor waters the plants too enthusiastically. The desk, now viewed from this lower angle, feels slightly more imposing. The copper coil no longer leans casually. It looms, its circular form catching the light in a way that reminds him faintly of a planet's ring system. Not Saturn exactly, too irregular, but maybe Saturn after some slightly careless handling. The glass jar, meanwhile, now towers over the screws, the way a lighthouse might loom over a cluster of fishing boats. On the far left corner of the desk there's a notebook, thick, square-bound and heavy enough to suggest it contains something important. Elias flips it open. The first page is covered in diagrams that look like they belong to a device halfway between a perpetual motion machine and a coffee grinder. Lines arc gracefully into nothing. Arrows point at components that have yet to exist. Annotations written in small, cramped handwriting explain very little, even to him. Halfway down the page he finds a note to himself from 3 weeks ago. Remember to buy more tea, the good kind. An arrow links this reminder to a drawing of what is presumably a gear mechanism, which makes him question whether the tea was part of the design or merely part of the day. He turns the page slowly, because paper should always be turned slowly. There is no good reason to rush. Paper is not going anywhere unless a strong breeze or a particularly curious cat intervenes. The next page is blank except for a single sentence written neatly in the top left corner. It will save them all. He stares at it for a long moment. It does not clarify who them is. It also does not clarify how. But in his mind, both are perfectly obvious. Though he suspects if he tried to explain it aloud, the explanation would collapse into something that sounded more like weather talk than science. From somewhere outside, the faint sound of a bicycle bell drifts in through the open window. It has nothing to do with his work, and yet it feels like a reminder that the rest of the world is moving forward while he is here, in this small pocket of stillness, considering whether the copper coil should be turned precisely 2 degrees clockwise. He leans forward, not to adjust it but just to look at it more closely, as if proximity alone might whisper some hidden truth about its role in the grand design. It doesn't, but it does catch the light differently, and for now, that feels like progress. Elias stands up again. This, like the sitting earlier, is not abrupt. In fact, if one were to watch him, it might be mistaken for a form of gentle stretching, a careful unspooling of limbs, the gradual straightening of the spine, and a small pause halfway through, as if reconsidering whether standing is truly worth the effort. It is, at least for the moment. His attention returns to the main contraption, the one that currently exists as a small, hesitant cluster of components, rather than the world-saving apparatus he imagines. On the workbench, beside the copper coil, sits a flat metal plate the size of a dinner tray. It's not particularly shiny, nor particularly dull, existing in that middle ground where you can never tell whether polishing it would improve anything, or simply make it look like it's trying too hard. He lifts the plate carefully as though its current angle is integral to the laws of physics, which, in his own way of thinking, it might be. There is a smudge near the center, not quite a fingerprint, more like a faint shadow. He considers cleaning it, then decides against it. There's a sort of dignity in leaving certain marks untouched, as if to say, yes, this has been handled, yes, it has history. Beside the plate, a tangle of insulated wires lies in a heap, curling over each other in a way that suggests they were placed there deliberately, though in reality they were not. Each one has a small piece of masking tape near its end, marked with codes in Elias's cramped, looping handwriting. P2. GR3. Test? The question mark in particular does not inspire confidence, but it does lend the setup an appealing air of mystery. He begins arranging the wires, not in the way one might if the goal were efficiency, but in the way one might arrange flowers in a vase, balancing lengths, adjusting curves, considering which ones should be near each other purely for aesthetic satisfaction. Occasionally he pauses, looking from the wires to the copper coil and back again, as if waiting for them to suggest the next step. They remain silent, as most inanimate objects do. Somewhere behind him the kettle clicks as it finishes boiling. This means tea, but tea can wait. Or perhaps tea is the reason to pause, which is just another form of waiting. He turns, takes 2 slow steps to the counter, and reaches for the tin. It's the good kind, as noted in his notebook, though the definition of good here is more about reliability than any particular flavor brilliance. While the tea steeps, he leans against the counter and looks back at the workbench. The invention, or the pre-invention, really, sits there, quietly existing, neither further along nor less complete than it was a few minutes ago. And this, Elias thinks, is fine. Sometimes the act of being near the thing is its own kind of progress. By the time he returns to the stool with the steaming mug, the wires have somehow shifted minutely in the way objects seem to when left alone, even though he knows they haven't. He takes a sip, grimaces at the temperature, and sets the mug down. There will be more adjusting, more aligning, more silent, almost meditative consideration of parts. And, eventually, there will be movement toward the idea in his head. But for now, it's enough to sit here in the soft hum of his laboratory that isn't quite ready, listening to the distant creak of the building, and the faint, rhythmic tick of the wall clock. It's all moving forward, in a way so slow it might not look like movement at all. It begins, as mornings do, with the faintest awareness that time is happening again. Elias's eyes are not yet open, but his brain has begun the slow administrative process of waking, not the brisk clipboard and checklist sort of process that other people might experience, but a long, meandering committee meeting with no clear agenda. Somewhere in there, a subcommittee proposes the idea of moving one arm. This is considered, debated, tabled, for later discussion. The room smells faintly of last night's tea, and the paper-thin soap from the wash basin in the corner. There's a quiet stillness broken only by the occasional settling groan of the building, which Elias finds oddly reassuring, as though the walls are stretching themselves awake too. One eyelid makes the first, tentative attempt at opening just a fraction, letting in a sliver of pale morning light that has already filtered through linen curtains, bounced off the wooden floor and diffused into something soft enough not to be bothersome. It is the kind of light that is in no hurry to announce the day, preferring to suggest it gently, as if saying, "Whenever you're ready." The arm committee reconvenes. This time, a slow, careful stretch is approved. His right hand drifts over the quilt, fingers brushing the slightly uneven stitches. A reminder that the quilt was handmade, possibly by someone with no great love of straight lines. It's warm enough to keep him in bed longer, which it will. For now, he simply lies there, in the drifting half-state between sleep and waking, letting the thought of standing remain a vague possibility somewhere in the distance. It is at least 15 minutes before Elias decides to sit up, and even then, the decision is provisional. First, there's a trial movement, a gentle lifting of the head from the pillow, followed by the quiet return of said head back to the pillow, as though to confirm that it is still there. Then, a slow roll to the side, legs sliding toward the edge of the bed, with all the urgency of a glacier approaching a shoreline. When he finally pushes himself upright, it is with a quiet sigh that sounds almost ceremonial, like the moment in a concert when the conductor raises the baton. The floor greets his bare feet with a cool, faintly textured welcome. He sits there for a while, elbows on knees, gazing at the floorboards. They are not perfectly aligned. A slight warp here, a gap there, and it strikes him, not for the first time, that the floorboards have more personality than certain people he has met. He rubs his face with both hands, not to speed himself up, but more as an act of recognition. Yes, we are awake now, possibly. From his seat at the bed's edge, he glances toward the workbench, in the corner of the room. The invention in progress is exactly as he left it. Unchanged, unbothered by the passing night. In some ways, this is comforting. He likes things that wait for him. Before he even thinks about approaching it, however, there is the matter of tea. Tea always comes first. The kettle is in the kitchen, which is technically the next room, though calling it a separate room might be generous. It is more of an annex, really, separated from the main living space by a low wooden partition that Elias once intended to varnish but never did. He fills the kettle with water that runs from the tap in a polite but unhurried stream. As the water level rises, he counts the seconds without any intention of stopping at a specific number. Counting, he has found, is simply a nice thing to do in the morning, like talking to a pet that doesn't exist. The tea tin is brought down from the shelf and opened with a satisfying little pop. Inside, the leaves are dark, irregularly curled and fragrant in a way that is not dramatic but persistent, like a quiet person with excellent posture. While the water heats, Elias leans on the counter, gazing absently out the small window above the sink. The view is not impressive. Just the back wall of another building, its bricks damp with morning. But there is a patch of sky in the upper corner, and a thin wisp of cloud drifts lazily through it, moving at a speed he considers admirable. The kettle finally clicks off, and he pours the water into the waiting mug. No rushing here. The pour is slow, deliberate, a little spiral of steam rising in a gentle column. The tea bag is lowered into the water, like a dignitary stepping onto a stage, and Elias watches as the liquid blooms into its first hints of amber. He lets it steep longer than most people would, because that is the point, not to make the tea stronger, but to make the morning longer. When the mug is finally in his hands, he carries it back to the table and sits, sipping in small measured intervals, as though this were a delicate experiment rather than breakfast. The day has begun, yes, but in the Elias way, slowly, intentionally, and with no great concern for efficiency. The invention can wait. The morning, after all, is an invention of its own. There are mornings when Elias believes, with absolute conviction, that the entire world can be boiled down to the sound of a pencil rolling very slowly across a wooden desk. It's a gentle, deliberate sound, not quite a clatter, not quite a slide. And it has a way of announcing that time is, indeed, passing, not quickly, not urgently, but passing nonetheless. This morning the pencil in question has decided to stop midway across the desk, wedged against the slightly raised grain in the wood. Elias looks at it for a moment longer than strictly necessary, as if the pencil might at any second declare its own opinion on today's work. It doesn't, of course. But still, he waits. The air in the laboratory is cool, and smells faintly of metal shavings. Not sharp exactly, but noticeable, like the ghost of an old hardware shop that's been politely lingering in the corners for decades. The window is open just enough to let in a draft that curls around the ankles before disappearing, possibly into some forgotten gap between floorboards. On the workbench, his invention sits exactly where it did yesterday, and the day before, and the day before that. Some people might call this stagnation. Elias calls it acclimatization time, a necessary period during which the invention adjusts to the concept of being built. You wouldn't expect a cat to immediately accept a new piece of furniture without at least 3 days of pretending it doesn't exist. The same, in his mind, applies to prototypes. He reaches for a small piece of sandpaper. It's not strictly part of today's plan. Not that there is a plan in the conventional sense, but the gentle, repetitive rasp of sanding has a way of clearing the mind. The movement is slow, unhurried. The sandpaper works against the copper surface, producing a muted hiss. And after a minute or so, Elias inspects the result. It looks almost exactly the same as it did before, which, in a curious way, is comforting. Somewhere beyond the half-closed door, the kettle begins to hum. He'll get to it in a moment, but for now there is the sandpaper, and the faint warmth of the morning sun slipping across the desk, like a very lazy cat. Patience, after all, is as much a part of invention as the invention itself. By the time Elias remembers the kettle, the water has cooled slightly, which means he'll have to boil it again. This is not a setback. In fact, it's a small pleasure. Boiling the kettle twice gives the illusion of having done something twice as important. While he waits, his eyes wander to a small tray of screws on the windowsill. They are not arranged by size or type, but by a system only he understands, a system which, if diagrammed on paper, would look suspiciously like random placement. Still, each screw knows where it belongs, even if no one else does. He picks one up between thumb and forefinger. It's a brass screw, slightly tarnished, with the kind of patina that says, "I have been waiting for the right moment to be useful for at least a decade." Elias turns it over, feeling the subtle weight. There's something reassuring about objects that don't rush themselves into purpose. The kettle clicks again. This time he pours the water over a tea bag in slow looping circles, as if coaxing out the flavor by charm rather than heat. Steam rises, curling upwards in thin, precise ribbons before dissolving entirely. Not unlike an idea that seems brilliant in the shower and then fades somewhere between the towel and the socks. Back at the workbench, he places the tea carefully on a coaster. He has exactly 3 coasters in the laboratory, none of which match, but all of which have been chosen for their ability to bear the occasional spillage without visible resentment. The invention itself is left untouched for the moment. Elias prefers to look at it from different angles while sipping tea, giving it what he calls thinking distance. This involves leaning slightly forward, then back, then tilting his head to one side in a way that makes him look like he's listening for a small bird in the rafters. Somewhere in all this head tilting and tea sipping, progress is being made, or at least, that's what Elias tells himself. The afternoon light changes slowly in this room, shifting from a soft yellow to something a little warmer, as though the sun is making a half-hearted effort to be dramatic before disappearing behind the rooftops. Elias notices the shift, not because it changes the way he works, but because it's the sort of thing one should notice if one intends to live at all attentively. He places the mug down, now mostly empty except for the last sip, which will be saved for no particular reason, other than the comfort of knowing it's there, and reaches for the cloth that lives permanently on the edge of the bench. It is, officially, a polishing cloth. Unofficially, it's also a dusting cloth, a grease wipe, a tea ring remover, and occasionally a napkin. With slow, even strokes, he begins to polish a small section of the copper coil. Not enough to change its overall look. Just enough to remind it, and himself, that it is still worth the care. Somewhere between the 3rd and 4th stroke, his mind drifts to the question of whether the coil prefers this gentle attention to the rougher sandpaper treatment from earlier. In a strictly scientific sense, it doesn't matter, but in the unspoken logic of Elias's laboratory, it matters quite a lot. The clock on the wall ticks in a rhythm that feels slower than time itself. Outside, a single pigeon makes a sound that could be described as half-hearted cooing, as though it too has decided that rushing would be in poor taste today. By the time Elias leans back on the stool, the light in the room has taken on that peculiar, end-of-day softness. The invention sits before him, still incomplete, still stubbornly itself. He nods at it, not as a farewell, but as an acknowledgement. Tomorrow perhaps there will be actual construction, or perhaps there will be more tea, more polishing, more looking at the thing from slightly different angles. Both, in their own ways, would be progress. By the time Elias notices that the afternoon has arrived, it's already halfway over. This is not because the hours have been sneaky, but because his attention has been so delightfully elsewhere. Not focused exactly, but gently hovering over various thoughts, occasionally resting on one before gliding to another. The light has changed again. Earlier, the sun had been the sort that fills a room like an enthusiastic houseguest, making itself very obvious and very present. Now it's more of a polite visitor, still there, but quieter, as though it's trying not to interrupt. It slides in through the high workshop windows at a slant, landing across the floor in slow-moving shapes that stretch themselves like sleepy cats. Elias is in his chair, but not the stool at the workbench. No, this is his thinking chair, a wide, soft thing that has probably absorbed more of his ideas than any notebook ever has. It has a dip in the cushion that fits him perfectly, though whether the chair has shaped itself to him or he has shaped himself to it is hard to say. From here he can see the invention, or at least the parts of it that are currently in some kind of agreement with each other. The copper coil is still in its place, though perhaps it leans slightly more to the left than it did this morning. The wires, draped carefully after his earlier arranging, have not moved. The metal plate still has its faint smudge. None of these things have changed in any dramatic way, and yet they seem different, simply because he's seeing them from a new angle. He takes a sip from his tea. It is lukewarm now. Not unpleasantly so, just a different experience. Lukewarm tea doesn't demand attention. It doesn't try to impress. It's simply there, as dependable as the chair and the afternoon light. His eyes drift to the far wall, where the pegboard holds tools in neat but not too neat rows. Some are hanging at perfect right angles, others at slight, almost imperceptible tilts. The hammer, rarely used, hangs like a prop from an earlier era, when hitting things with force seemed like a reasonable approach to problem solving. The pliers, on the other hand, are slightly askew, suggesting recent use, though recent in Elias's timeline could mean anything from today to last month. Outside, the muffled sound of the street hums along, a bicycle bell somewhere in the distance, the faint rumble of a passing cart, a pair of voices having a conversation that's just out of range to make out words. All of it blends into a kind of background lull, a low hum that seems designed for thinking without necessarily reaching any conclusions. Elias sets his mug down on the low table beside him. He leans back a little more in the chair. The invention is still there, still waiting. The afternoon is still here, still stretching itself toward evening. And he is still in the middle of both, doing exactly what he should be doing, which, to the casual observer, might look like nothing at all. The workshop by this hour has settled into what Elias privately calls the long hum. It isn't an actual sound, not exactly, but a feeling. A kind of invisible, steady presence that wraps around the room once the sunlight has taken on that more golden sideways quality. The air itself feels thicker, softer. He leans forward just enough to rest his elbows on his knees. His fingertips brush together, lightly, thoughtfully, as though they might be testing some invisible equation between them. He is not solving anything in particular. Sometimes it is enough to simply be in the presence of a problem, without pressing it for answers. The invention sits there with the kind of patience that only inanimate objects truly have. There is no hint of annoyance in its unchanging form. It is, if anything, the model of composure, all coiled wires and unpolished edges, waiting for him to eventually decide something about it. The copper, in this light, seems almost alive, the metal catching the sun in such a way that its surface looks warmer than it really is. If one were feeling especially poetic, they might say it had the color of late summer honey. Elias is, however, only half poetic, so the thought comes and goes without much fanfare. On the far side of the table, the stack of notebooks leans slightly to one side, their edges softened by months of being shifted, opened and closed again. He knows that somewhere in there, perhaps page 93 of the green one, or page 120 in the blue one with the coffee stain, there is a sentence he wrote last winter that might be useful now. He could get up and look for it. He could, but he does not yet. A faint creak of wood draws his eyes toward the window. Outside, a branch sways gently in the breeze, and the sunlight, interrupted for a moment, moves like a living shadow across the table. The movement is slow, but noticeable enough to remind him that the day is progressing whether or not he participates in it. His gaze lingers on the invention once more. He tilts his head slightly, as though to see it from a fresh perspective. It looks almost exactly the same from here. Still, the act of looking has value. It tells the invention, and perhaps himself, that he is paying attention, even in this quiet, elongated moment. The tea, now entirely cool, sits within reach. He picks it up again, not because he particularly wants more, but because it feels like part of the ritual. A sip, a pause, a glance at the invention. Repeat. Somewhere between one sip and the next glance, Elias lets his shoulders relax, and the afternoon hum folds itself more firmly around him, like a blanket he didn't realize he'd been wearing all along. By now the light in the workshop has shifted again, deepening into that late afternoon stage where it seems to hesitate before sliding toward evening. It catches on the smallest things, the rim of a screw, the edge of a glass jar, and gives them each a brief golden outline before moving on. Elias has abandoned even the idea of movement for now. He's in the kind of stillness that feels deliberate, though it's mostly just comfortable. The chair, the cup, the invention, they all exist in a kind of quiet companionship, none of them asking anything from the others. The invention, in particular, has become almost meditative to look at. Every curve of the wire, every tiny imperfection in the soldering, every faint smudge on the metal surface becomes its own small landscape. He finds himself mentally wandering along these miniature terrains, like a traveler moving slowly through a familiar but endlessly interesting countryside. A faint sound from outside, perhaps a cartwheel over uneven stones, drifts in, then fades again. The silence that follows is not empty, but full of the soft creaks and shifts of the building itself. The wood expands and contracts with the warmth. Somewhere, a hinge adjusts itself, with the slowest, quietest sigh. Elias rests one hand on the arm of the chair, the other loosely cradling the mug. The tea is now entirely room temperature, indistinguishable from the air in which it sits. It is still drinkable, still the same tea it has been all day. But it no longer announces itself, it simply exists. He wonders, in an idle way, whether the invention will ever be done. The word feels too final, too abrupt. Inventions, in his view, are more like gardens than finished products. They are tended, adjusted, sometimes left alone to see what happens. And like gardens, they can be endlessly improved upon, or endlessly ignored, depending on the mood. The shadows on the floor have grown longer, stretching almost to the far wall now. The afternoon has started its slow exhale. Somewhere between this moment and the next, Elias decides that doing nothing, or at least, doing very little, has been a perfectly reasonable use of his time. The hum of the workshop holds steady, the light lingers just a little longer, and Elias, without making any noticeable movement at all, continues to keep company with the invention, the chair, and the unhurried drift of the day. The morning does not so much begin as it drifts in. A thin wash of pale light settles itself along the edges of the curtains, as though it is politely waiting for Elias to acknowledge it before stepping fully into the room. There is no urgency in this light, no theatrical sunrise pouring through the window, just a quiet, patient presence, like a guest who has arrived early and is content to wait in the hallway. Elias opens his eyes, though opens might be too energetic a word for it. It is more that his eyelids gradually stop blocking the light. For a while, he simply lies there, not out of reluctance, but because lying there is a perfectly acceptable use of time. His pillow has developed a shape entirely suited to the back of his head, and the blanket has wrapped itself into a loose but reassuringly weighty cocoon. Eventually, a decision is made, or perhaps not so much made as arrived at, to shift from horizontal to vertical. Elias sits up slowly, the way one might approach a conversation they're not entirely ready for. His feet meet the floor, which greets them with the faint chill of early-day wood. In the kitchen, the kettle sits where he left it last night, entirely unchanged by the passage of time. He fills it without rush, the sound of water against metal as soft as rain in the next street over. The flame under the kettle is lit, not dramatically, but with the quiet cooperation of a match that has done this countless times before. While the water heats, Elias leans on the counter and glances out the small window above the sink. The sky is still in negotiation with the day, its colors somewhere between blue and gray. A single bird lands on the branch outside, surveys its surroundings without much enthusiasm, and then leaves again, possibly to find somewhere more interesting. The kettle takes its time. Steam begins to curl upward in small, hesitant wisps, as though it is testing the air before committing fully. The eventual whistle is not sharp but oddly restrained, like it too has been softened by the pace of the morning. Tea is made, leaves in pot, water over leaves, and the whole thing is left to steep. Elias does not watch it, he trusts the tea to know what it's doing. When it's poured, it releases that faint, earthy aroma that feels older than the room itself. Cup in hand, he drifts into the workshop, which has somehow managed to keep existing without him overnight. The invention is exactly where it was yesterday, every wire, every small imperfection untouched. It looks, in the early light, almost as though it has been holding its breath. Elias sets the cup down beside it, and settles into his chair. The day has begun, though not in the sense that anything is rushing. It's more that the day has agreed to be here, and so has he. By mid-morning the workshop has reached that rare balance where the air is neither cool nor warm, neither still nor moving. It's the kind of air that feels like it has been carefully calibrated to make you forget the existence of temperature entirely. A faint smell of tea leaves remains from earlier, quietly occupying the background like an extra in a play. Elias sits at his workbench, leaning just enough toward the invention to look like he might be doing something, though in reality, he has been staring at the same brass component for longer than is strictly reasonable. The component is not new, it has been part of the invention since the third week of building, but this morning it has taken on a slightly different personality. It seems a little more crooked than he remembers. Or perhaps it has always been crooked, and he is only now noticing. He reaches for a screwdriver, not because he's entirely certain of what he's about to do, but because holding a tool feels like progress. The screwdriver rests in his hand as if it too knows they won't be doing anything urgent. Elias taps it lightly against the workbench, producing a small, hollow tock sound, once, twice, 3 times, before setting it down again. Outside, the sunlight has grown bolder, spilling into the room in pale, dust-speckled beams. The dust floats in a slow, disorganized dance, each particle drifting as though it has nowhere in particular to be, which, in fairness, it doesn't. Elias watches them for a while, his eyes unfocusing in that pleasant way that makes time slip. The invention waits. It has the air of something that knows it will not be finished today, but is perfectly fine with that. Afternoon arrives without ceremony. No sudden change, no dramatic shift in light, just a quiet agreement between the sun and the hours that it is now later than it was before. Elias finds himself leaning back in his chair, one hand wrapped around a second cup of tea that has cooled to that lukewarm stage where you drink it more out of obligation than enjoyment. The invention sits in front of him like a guest who has overstayed but is still welcome. He studies it the way one might study the surface of a pond, noticing details without feeling the need to act on any of them. The fine wires catch the light in different ways as the sun shifts, and for a moment he considers whether they might be rearranged purely for aesthetic purposes. Then he decides against it. A gentle creak sounds from the far corner of the workshop, where the old wooden shelves have decided to adjust themselves. This prompts Elias to glance over at the jars of screws, nails, and other metal oddments lined neatly in a row. He thinks briefly about resorting them by size or perhaps by the decade in which he acquired them, and then remembers that such a system would require him to know the decade in which he acquired them. That ends the idea. The rest of the afternoon proceeds in a kind of comfortable stalemate between Elias and the invention. He considers a change, he does not make it. He imagines progress, none is physically achieved. And yet, by the time the shadows lengthen and the light begins to dim, it feels like a day well spent. When evening settles in fully, Elias tidies the workbench, not because it's messy, but because it's part of the ritual. The invention is left exactly as it was, wires slightly uneven, brass components still crooked. He turns out the light and leaves the workshop, confident that tomorrow will look almost exactly like today, which, for his purposes, is perfect. The morning began, if it could be said to have begun at all, in a way that suggested it had considered several options and decided on the slowest one. Light didn't so much stream through the curtains as it politely sidled in, carrying with it the cool scent of the outside air, that faint greenish smell that only exists in the first hour after sunrise, before the day has decided to get on with itself. Elias lay in bed for a long while, in that peculiar state where one is both awake and not quite ready to admit it. The ceiling above him was an old friend. Faint hairline cracks in the plaster mapping constellations he had traced so often that he could, in theory, name them. He never did, because naming them would feel like an act of completion, and completion, in his view, should be reserved for more urgent matters than ceiling cracks. The distant ticking of the clock in the next room played its familiar role, a kind of metronome for doing nothing. It wasn't the brisk, efficient ticking of a new clock. No. This was the languid, uneven kind that sounded as though each second was being hand-carried into the present by a small, slightly arthritic messenger. Eventually, and without any clear moment of decision, Elias sat up. The sheets, which had taken on the soft rumpled texture of well-slept-in cotton, pooled into his lap. The floorboards under his feet were cool. Not cold enough to be unpleasant, but just cool enough to remind him that slippers existed. He did not, however, fetch the slippers. Some mornings, bare feet felt like the correct historical choice. The kitchen awaited, though awaited implies a degree of expectation that kitchens don't generally have. More accurately, it continued existing in the way kitchens tend to do. Quietly, patiently, storing the night stillness until someone arrived to displace it with the sound of teaspoons and kettle lids. The kettle itself was the old metal sort, the kind that gave a little sigh as it began to warm. Like it, too, was easing into the day. Elias filled it with water, noting that the stream from the tap made a different sound when the sink was entirely empty, versus when it still had a forgotten teaspoon in it. Today, it was the empty kind of sound, bright, uninterrupted, almost bell-like in its clarity. He let the sound continue for a while, not because he needed more water, but because it was, inexplicably, satisfying. When the kettle finally began to hum, Elias selected his tea leaves. This was not a rushed choice. He considered the tin of strong black tea too assertive for today. The jar of green tea too grassy. He lingered over a small pouch of oolong, thinking about the word itself. Oolong. It sounded like something that might be both a tea and a species of slow-moving river creature. Eventually he decided on it, for reasons that were more textural than logical. The steam rose in a soft column, curling upward like a quiet thought that never quite reached the top of the mind. Elias let it steep longer than necessary, partly out of inattention, partly because time, this morning, had all the sharp edges filed off. By the time he carried the cup to the workroom, the tea had settled into that perfect temperature where you could drink without wincing, but still feel the warmth in your chest after each sip. He placed the cup on the bench beside the invention, which had been waiting all night with the kind of patience only inanimate objects can muster. The invention itself had gathered a thin coat of dust in the undisturbed hours, a pale veil over brass and wire. Elias didn't brush it away, there was no real need. Dust, in small doses, seemed to make things look wiser. And so, the morning unfolded, not with any grand act of creation, but with the slow accumulation of small, pleasant moments, each one as deliberate and unhurried as the last. The workbench, if one could call it that without implying more work had happened there than truly had, looked much the same as it had the night before. The invention sat in the center like a guest who had arrived early to a party, and was now quietly wondering if they had the wrong day. Elias stood over it, tea in hand, not so much inspecting as existing in its vicinity. His eyes moved over its pieces. The fine brass gears, the winding coils of copper, the small glass housing that caught the light in a way that made it look like it was thinking about something important. He set the tea down, then immediately picked it up again. The sip he took was more about confirming that it still tasted the same than about thirst. It did, satisfyingly so. From somewhere outside, a pigeon made the sort of noise pigeons have been making for thousands of years, a low, questioning coo that seemed unsure if it was worth repeating. The sound drifted in through the open window and lodged itself in the air above the workbench. It had no direct relevance to the invention, but then again, relevance was an overrated concept in Elias's mornings. A screwdriver lay within easy reach. He picked it up, turning it slowly in his fingers. The handle was smooth from years of similar, possibly unnecessary handling. He tightened a single screw, not because it was loose, but because the act of tightening something felt like a small, controllable victory. The invention responded by looking exactly the same as it had before. He considered making an adjustment to the wiring. The long copper strands were perfectly serviceable, but he had once read that a slightly tighter twist could improve conductivity. Of course, improve was a relative term. The current design wasn't exactly failing, but it also wasn't, well, it wasn't doing anything yet. Instead of acting on that thought, Elias glanced toward the window. A sliver of sunlight had crept in far enough to land on the wooden floorboards, where it had set up camp in a rectangular patch. The edges of the light were fuzzy, blurred by the thin curtain, and motes of dust floated lazily through it like tiny swimmers in a warm pool. He watched them for longer than would seem reasonable in retelling, though the dust motes themselves had no objection. Eventually he did reach for the wires, not to twist them but to move them a fraction of an inch to the left. This produced no measurable difference, but it felt right. That was enough. The tea by now had cooled to the point where its warmth was more of a memory than a fact. Elias drank the last of it and set the cup down, with the gentle finality of someone closing a book they've already read. There was a second cup of tea in his immediate future, not out of need, but out of habit, and perhaps as a way to buy more time before engaging with the truly uncertain work of actual invention. After all, tea had the advantage of guaranteed results. You put leaves in water, and you get tea. No suspense, no dramatic tension, no possibility of structural collapse. And so, with the same unhurried deliberation that had marked the rest of his morning, Elias drifted back toward the kitchen, leaving the invention to sit in quiet expectation for just a little while longer. The kettle began its slow song again, a sound that rose so gradually it seemed less like boiling water and more like the air itself was softly remembering something. Elias stood beside it, one hand resting lightly on the counter, as if he were supervising a very straightforward operation. The counter's surface bore faint marks from years of similar mornings, the shallow rings of mugs set down without coasters, the fine scratches from spoons that had wandered further than intended. All of it had the lived-in, unself-conscious quality of a space that had never been staged for anyone's approval. Steam curled upward from the spout in loose ribbons, each one breaking apart and reforming as it drifted toward the ceiling. Elias watched the steam for longer than was strictly necessary, not because it was doing anything especially captivating, but because it was there, and he had no urgent reason to look away. He poured the water over the tea leaves in slow, steady arcs, the way one might water a delicate plant. The leaves darkened almost instantly, releasing that familiar scent, earthy, slightly bitter, with the faintest suggestion that it could wake you up if it really tried. This time, instead of taking the tea straight back to the workbench, Elias lingered by the window. Outside, the world appeared to have agreed on a pace for the day. Neither hurried nor idle, just existing. A man down the street was carrying a ladder. Not using it, not particularly struggling with it, just carrying it from one place to another. A dog sniffed at the same patch of ground it had sniffed yesterday, as if expecting a completely different result. The tea cooled slightly in his hand, but not enough to notice without noticing. He sipped it anyway, the warmth settling into him like a slow tide. Eventually, here carries the weight of several unmeasured minutes. He returned to the workbench. The invention looked back at him, or at least seemed to. There was a shared stillness between them, the kind of moment when neither party is entirely sure who should make the first move. Elias rested his palm gently against the smooth metal casing. It was neither cold nor warm, just exactly itself. He imagined, not for the first time, that somewhere deep inside its intricate arrangement of gears and wires, the invention was quietly preparing to wake up. But of course inventions don't wake up. Not until someone decides to make them. He considered tightening another screw, or perhaps loosening one, just to see what would happen. He did neither. Instead, he sat down on the stool and took another sip of tea, letting the taste sit on his tongue for a moment before swallowing. The day would carry on whether he made progress or not. And perhaps, he thought as he set the cup down, there was a kind of progress in simply being here, in this room, with this thing, letting it exist a little longer before it became whatever it was meant to become. The light from the window had shifted again, stretching across the workbench until it touched the edge of the invention. Elias watched as the sunlight inched forward, slow enough to be invisible, inevitable enough to be trusted. He stayed there, still, and the invention stayed with him. Between them, there was no urgency at all. The afternoon crept into the workshop in the way afternoon often does, not by knocking politely at the door, but by quietly rearranging the quality of the light until you noticed it had arrived. Elias sat at the bench with his elbows resting on the worn wood, though resting implies they might get up again soon. They wouldn't, at least, not yet. His hands, loosely clasped, had settled into that particular posture they took on when his brain was still working, but his body had decided to run at half speed. The air was different now. Not dramatically so. There hadn't been a sudden gust or a suspicious drop in temperature, but there was a certain thickness to it, the way air feels when it has warmed itself all morning and decided to stay that way. Somewhere in the room the faint scent of machine oil mingled with the sharper, slightly medicinal smell of solder. Neither scent was unpleasant, both belonged here like background characters in a play that never ended. The invention, of course, sat precisely where it had been left. Elias liked to think it was patient, though it could equally be described as inert. The afternoon light reached it now, striking its surface in a way that softened its edges. Shadows gathered in the crevices between its parts, stretching and shifting with each tiny movement of the sun. On the far side of the bench, a cluster of tools lay scattered in what could be mistaken for chaos. But this was not chaos. This was Elias's version of order. Wrenches angled toward each other as if in conversation. A set of small screwdrivers lay fanned out like playing cards. There was even a folded cloth that had been placed there weeks ago with the intention of cleaning something, though what exactly had been forgotten. From somewhere down the street, the faint sound of a bell carried into the workshop. It could have been the bakery's bell, or perhaps the bicycle repair shop's door chime. Elias didn't check. Whatever it was, it belonged to the outside world, which could carry on without him for now. He leaned back slightly, the stool creaking in acknowledgement. His eyes traced the familiar lines of the invention's casing, lingering on a tiny screw that had been turned just enough to make it stand out from its neighbors. He imagined adjusting it. Imagined the cool feel of the screwdriver's handle, the satisfying click as it tightened into place. But imagining was, at this moment, plenty. A dust mote drifted lazily through the sunlight, spinning slowly as it descended. Elias watched it as though it might eventually land on something significant, but it floated on, indifferent to such expectations. There was no urgency here, no pressing deadline, only the gradual, almost imperceptible unfolding of the day. The afternoon light continued its quiet work, changing everything, and nothing at once. Elias let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Not the dramatic kind that novels are so fond of, but the subtle sort, the kind that simply reminds you that you're still here, still breathing, still waiting for the next small thing to happen. The next moment, if you could call it a moment at all, arrived not with a sound or a sudden change, but with the faintest shift in where the sunlight fell. It had edged itself a little farther across the bench, claiming territory it had been eyeing all morning. Elias noticed, not because the change was dramatic, but because he had been quietly watching for it without realizing. The beam now touched the corner of a small dented metal tin that held spare washers. The tin was unremarkable in almost every way. A dull gray, lid slightly loose, no markings save for a faint scratch across its surface. And yet, with the light on it, it looked almost important, as if some ancient treasure might be inside. There wasn't, of course. Unless you count small, circular bits of metal as treasure, which Elias sometimes did, on days when his definition of treasure was particularly generous. He reached out, not to open the tin, but to shift it half an inch, just enough so that the sunlight could slide along its edge in a slow, deliberate reveal. The tin made the faintest scrape against the wood as it moved, the kind of sound you only hear in a room that is otherwise perfectly still. From outside, the air brought in a hint of warm bread. That likely meant the bakery was still at work, turning out loaves for the evening crowd. Elias allowed himself a moment to imagine the crust cracking under a knife, the soft steam curling into the air. It wasn't that he was hungry, he wasn't, but the image seemed to go nicely with the hum of the afternoon. He picked up a screwdriver from the table, not to use it, not yet, but simply to feel its weight in his hand. The handle was smooth from years of use, its once bright paint worn down in places to the bare metal beneath. Elias rolled it between his fingers, noting the way the light caught on its shaft. He set it down again exactly where it had been. Somewhere on the wall, a shadow had lengthened. It was the shadow of a coiled cable, hanging neatly from a hook. In the soft golden light, it resembled a loose spiral drawn in ink, the kind of doodle someone might make absent-mindedly while listening to a lecture. Elias wondered, briefly, whether anyone had ever appreciated that cable before. Probably not. He was fairly certain it was experiencing the peak of its artistic career right now. The ticking clock in the corner continued its slow count. Each tick was spaced just far enough apart to make you aware of how long a second truly was, if you bothered to notice. Elias, naturally, noticed. His eyes drifted to the invention again. It looked the same, but there was something about the way the light played across its surface now, as if it was holding a secret it might choose to reveal only when no one was watching. He leaned back, hands resting loosely in his lap. The room had the kind of stillness that felt almost engineered, as if the air itself had decided to slow down so as not to disturb anything. Even the dust motes seemed to have agreed to move in exaggeratedly slow arcs, like dancers in a performance meant to last all day. There was nothing pressing to do, no immediate problem to solve, just the light, the quiet, and the steady presence of the thing he had been building. A thing that might one day change everything, though for now it was perfectly content to change nothing at all. By the time the sun reached the far side of the workbench, the room had taken on that particular shade of gold that seems less like a color and more like a temperature. Not hot, exactly. Just pleasantly warm, like the memory of having been in sunlight an hour ago. Elias sat without moving for a while, watching how the light gathered itself into thicker, richer pools on the floorboards. The patterns were soft-edged, as if the sun hadn't quite committed to their exact shapes. One stripe bent gently where the floorboard shifted, another stretched toward the wall, making slow, almost imperceptible progress. In one corner, a jar of screws caught a glint and sent it back in a faint, lazy shimmer. It was the kind of detail that, in another setting, you might not notice at all. But here, in the steady quiet of the workshop, it felt like an event worth registering. Elias tilted his head, just slightly, so that the shimmer shifted, then let it return to where it had been. The hum of the afternoon seemed to grow heavier, as though the air was gently settling on everything. Even his thoughts had slowed to the pace of syrup pouring from a spoon. They moved in long, lazy loops, circling back on themselves, sometimes stopping altogether to linger on nothing in particular. He found himself considering the lid of the small metal tin again. Why had no one ever designed a washer container that stacked perfectly without sliding? Would that be difficult? Was it worth doing? He let the question drift away without needing an answer. From outside, the faint sound of a wheelbarrow squeaking along the cobblestones came and went. The noise was not intrusive, more like a passing note in a song you weren't really listening to. Somewhere much farther away a dog barked twice, then seemed to decide it had said enough. Elias rested one elbow on the bench, chin in his hand. The invention sat quietly under the fading sun, its curved metal surfaces now deeper in tone, edges softened by the changing light. If you didn't know better, you might think it was simply a piece of furniture, something functional but unremarkable. Elias knew better. He knew that inside its unassuming frame was a mechanism that, in theory, could change the balance of energy forever. In theory. For now, it was content to sit and look harmless. He let his gaze drift upward, following the ceiling beams. Between them, in the shallow pockets where dust collected, tiny motes floated lazily, spinning in place as if they had nowhere particular to be. He envied them, just a little. No deadlines, no design adjustments, no blueprints, just the slow dance through sunlight. The clock ticked again. The sound seemed softer now, cushioned by the weight of the afternoon. Elias felt his eyelids grow heavier, not from fatigue exactly, but from that gentle surrender to stillness that comes when nothing demands your attention. He allowed his head to rest more fully in his hand, the wood of the bench warm beneath his arm. The invention remained in his peripheral vision, steady, unhurried, and utterly patient. There would be time to work on it later. Time to test, to adjust, to argue with himself over the smallest details. For now, there was only this. The last stretch of afternoon light spilling gently over the bench, the quiet hum of the workshop, and the comfortable sense that nothing, absolutely nothing, needed to be done just yet. The sun did not set all at once. It withdrew in stages, the light thinning almost politely, as if reluctant to leave too abruptly. First, the golden tones on the bench paled, turning the color of old paper. Then the edges of the shadows softened, until they were less like outlines, and more like faint suggestions. Elias noticed the shift in the same way he noticed most changes in the workshop, slowly, with a kind of passive curiosity. He didn't turn his head to track it. He simply became aware that the room was less warm, less bright. The wood grain of the table was still visible, but it no longer glowed. Outside, the air seemed to thicken. He couldn't see it from where he sat. But he could tell the sky had moved into that gray-blue stage, the one that is neither day nor night but some temporary arrangement in between. It was the hour when colors seemed to step back, leaving behind their quieter, more retiring versions. In the corner, the jar of screws no longer caught the light. It was just a dark shape now, indistinct, its glinting earlier self gone. The invention, too, had lost its metallic shine. Its form had become something else entirely. Not a polished piece of engineering, but a shadowed outline, a quiet presence in the dim. Elias breathed in through his nose, slowly. The air had cooled in that subtle way you only notice after a long stretch of stillness. It carried the faintest scent of dust and wood shavings, and something else, perhaps the lingering tang of oil on metal. Not strong enough to draw his attention, but there, all the same, like a background hum. Somewhere far down the street, a door closed. The sound was softened by distance, wrapped in the dusk. It joined the other minor sounds of evening. The small clicks and sighs of the building settling, the faint creak of cooling beams, the soft scratch of a mouse somewhere in the walls. He did not light a lamp, not yet. There was a strange contentment in letting the room dim, in watching as the outlines of things became harder to separate. The familiar clutter of the workbench melted into a single dark mass, details dissolving in the absence of light. He leaned back slightly, chair tipping on its rear legs until it found its balance. The ceiling beams above were barely visible now, just faint shapes against the deepening gray. Between them, the dust motes had disappeared, or perhaps they were still there, but now invisible. A quiet vanishing act performed without fanfare. The invention sat motionless, but Elias could almost imagine it breathing in time with the room, not literally, of course. That would be absurd. And yet, in the quiet, its presence seemed more alive than before, like something waiting, patient and sure of its moment. The air grew cooler still, enough that he could feel it along the backs of his hands. He rested them on the bench, palms down, feeling the faint chill of the wood. Time moved without urgency here. Minutes passed in a way that felt neither short nor long, just inevitable. Elias let his eyes wander over the darkening shapes, tracing where one ended and another began. The difference between invention and shadow, between bench and floor, grew less distinct with each passing moment. Eventually, he suspected, there would be no difference at all. Elias waited longer than necessary before reaching for the lamp. It wasn't out of laziness, but rather because the darkness hadn't yet reached a point that demanded action. He liked that moment in between, when the light had faded enough to change the room's personality, but not enough to make it unusable. The lamp was a small thing, older than most of the tools in the workshop. Its base was heavy and round, its brass dulled by years of handling, and its glass chimney faintly smudged from the last cleaning that had been, well, he couldn't remember exactly when. That was the sort of detail he filed under, eventually. When his hand finally reached out for the wick, the movement was deliberate, almost ceremonial. The sound of the flint striking was sharper than expected in the muffled evening air. A brief, bright click that echoed in the small space. A moment later, a thread of flame appeared, quivering with the smallest draft from under the door. Light returned to the workbench in slow degrees, like water seeping into dry cloth. The invention emerged first as a glimmer, then as a full, rounded presence. Its metal caught the lamplight and softened it, turning it into a warm, honeyed reflection. Edges that had vanished in the dim now reasserted themselves, not harshly, but gently, as though they were introducing themselves for the second time that day. The rest of the bench followed suit. The grain in the wood reappeared, a familiar pattern Elias could have traced blindfolded. Shadows shortened and tucked themselves neatly behind objects, behaving now that there was a source to keep them in order. The jar of screws became a jar again, its glass catching little points of gold. Outside the window, nothing had changed. The street still lay in its blue-gray quiet, but the workshop had taken on its own, separate evening atmosphere. The lamplight created a circle of activity within a larger sea of stillness, a private island of clarity surrounded by dark. Elias sat forward now, elbows resting on the bench. The invention's surface looked warmer under this light, as though it had absorbed some of the day's fading heat, and was quietly holding on to it. He brushed his fingertips across the top, not to test anything, not to adjust, just to feel the faint difference between cool brass and the faint warmth it remembered from earlier. The flame shifted slightly, its movement mirrored in tiny highlights along the invention's curved sides. Elias watched as the reflections trembled and steadied again, a small, looping dance that repeated itself whenever the air moved. It was, he decided, exactly the kind of visual distraction that could keep him sitting here for a very long time, doing nothing of measurable importance. Somewhere in the background the slow tick of the wall clock carried on, unbothered by the dimness or the lamplight. It wasn't loud, not intrusive, but steady enough to be part of the room's structure, like a beam you don't notice until it's gone. Elias took another slow breath and felt the pace of the evening settle into him. The workshop had reached a point where time could stretch thin, where even small gestures, adjusting the wick, moving a single screw from one side of the bench to the other, could feel like entire events. He sat without hurry, letting the quiet remain uninterrupted. The lamp glowed on, steady and patient, as if it knew there was no reason to rush through this gray hour turned gold. Elias did eventually move. Not suddenly, not in a way that might suggest any urgency, but in a gradual, almost reluctant manner, as though he'd been coaxed out of stillness by the soft insistence of the lamplight. His hands found a cloth, not because anything was particularly dirty, but because it seemed right to begin with something small, something harmless. He leaned in and began wiping the invention's curved surface. The motion was slow enough that each pass of the cloth could have been mistaken for him simply resting his hand there. He wasn't scrubbing, merely gliding over the metal, feeling the faint bumps and dips that weren't really imperfections, just part of the way things exist when they're handled and used. The brass deepened in color where the cloth passed, its surface gathering a subtle sheen under the glow of the lamp. In some places, the reflection was strong enough to catch the shape of his fingers, stretched and warped like a dream seen through water. Elias found himself pausing often, not because the task was tiring, but because the changes were so small they were worth inspecting one by one. When he turned the invention slightly, the shadows rearranged themselves. Little screws cast elongated shapes across the wood, their outlines crisp at the top and dissolving into a soft blur at the base. A faint smell of metal and oil rose into the air. Not unpleasant, but old and settled. The kind of scent that suggested years of quiet making. On the far side of the workbench, a jar of washers waited. Elias picked it up and shook it gently, producing a sound that was almost like coins but duller, softer. He set the jar down again without opening it. Just hearing the sound had been enough to remind him they were there. He reached for a small tool, a screwdriver with a handle worn smooth from years of use. The wood felt warm, not from the lamp, but from the countless times it had been held. He set the tip into a single screw on the invention and turned, just enough to feel the resistance. It wasn't loose, it wasn't tight, it was simply there, holding as it always had. Satisfied, though perhaps content was the better word, he moved to the next one. This went on for some time. There was no real pattern to the screws he chose. He simply worked on the ones that caught his eye, turning each a fraction, then leaving it exactly as it had been. The rhythm was gentle, without pressure. Occasionally he'd stop to adjust the lamp's wick, lowering it slightly so the shadows deepened again, then raising it a touch to restore the gold. Outside, the night was well and truly settled. Through the window the street now appeared almost flat, as though the darkness had smoothed away any details that might have distracted him. The only movement came from a moth, circling lazily near the glass, its shadow flickering on the inside wall. Elias watched it for a while, long enough to forget momentarily that he was holding a tool. By the time he set the screwdriver down, the workshop felt warmer, as though the act of simply being here, of breathing, adjusting, observing, had generated its own atmosphere. The invention sat in the center of it all, unchanged in any measurable way, yet somehow more itself than it had been an hour ago. Elias leaned back in his chair, hands resting on his thighs. He didn't think about what he would do next. There would be a next. There always was, but it could wait. For now, the lamp burned steadily, the clock ticked, and the invention sat between them, like a patient companion. The evening could go on like this indefinitely, and Elias, without admitting it aloud, wouldn't mind if it did. The morning didn't so much arrive as it seeped in. The way warmth creeps into a room when someone has quietly closed a window during the night. Elias's eyes opened partway, then lingered in that uncertain space between sleep and waking, where thoughts arrive slowly and dissolve before they have time to matter. The light in his workshop was not yet the strong, directional kind that makes shadows sharp. It was diffused, pale, as though it had filtered through several layers of gauze before reaching the window. Dust motes moved through it in drifting, uncommitted spirals, rising and falling in slow negotiation with the air. Elias stayed in bed for a long time, the blanket gathered over him in soft folds that clung slightly when he moved. The fabric had cooled overnight but still carried traces of his warmth, the kind that fades reluctantly. Somewhere beyond the workshop walls, a cart rattled over cobblestones, the sound muffled by distance and the peculiar acoustics of the morning. He turned his head toward the window. Condensation streaked the glass in thin, uneven lines, catching the light so that each droplet glowed faintly. Beyond them, the street appeared slightly warped, its edges bent and softened by the uneven surface. A lone figure passed, their shape stretched by the distortion. A long, silent silhouette that seemed to glide more than walk. Elias closed his eyes again, not to sleep but to prolong the transition. Waking fully felt like too abrupt a commitment for a morning like this. Instead, he let his awareness trickle outward in increments. The faint smell of oil and wood dust reached him first, then the sound of a hinge somewhere shifting slightly. Perhaps the front door of the building below. perhaps just the frame settling. When he finally sat up, it was without urgency. The blanket slid from his shoulders with a whisper of fabric, folding over itself at his waist. His bare feet found the wooden floorboards, cool but not cold. They held the faint grainy texture of dust. Not enough to bother sweeping for yet, just enough to register under the skin. Across the room, the invention sat where it had been left, a silent shape against the dim background. The brass fittings were dull in the morning light, their usual gleam replaced with a muted, almost contemplative sheen. Elias regarded it without moving toward it. There would be time for that later. There was always time for that later. He reached for his mug, the one with a chip near the rim that he always forgot about until the moment he took a sip, and found it empty. The residue of yesterday's tea clung to the inside, faint and irregular, like a map whose borders no longer mattered. Somewhere beneath the floorboards, a pipe gave a low, hollow knock, followed by a sighing rush of water. The sound was slow, steady, unhurried, as though the building itself was only just coming awake. Elias breathed with it for a moment, the rhythm setting a kind of quiet baseline for the room. There was no plan for the day, or rather, there were too many small, indistinct plans to choose from, and so they cancelled each other out into something softer. A vague intention to exist near the workbench, to make minor adjustments to things that didn't really need adjusting, to drink tea and watch the light shift until evening made it all look different again. For now, though, he sat at the edge of the bed, listening to the morning stretch itself thin across the city, each sound and shadow finding its own slow place to settle. Elias eventually rose, though rose might be too ambitious a word. It was more of a gradual tilt forward, then a pause, then the eventual agreement between his upper body and his legs that standing might be worth the effort. The floor creaked once in protest, as if to remind him that every step in this workshop was a negotiation between wood, weight, and patience. He crossed the short distance to the small counter where his kettle waited, sitting just where he had left it the night before. Slightly askew, the handle leaning toward the window as though it had spent the night trying to get a better view. Filling the kettle was a task that moved at its own pace. The water tap sputtered once, then twice, before releasing a thin stream that grew into something steady, but not hurried. The sound of it hitting the metal inside was oddly resonant, as if the kettle had more depth this morning than usual. Elias watched the water climb inside, the surface trembling lightly under the flow. When it was full enough, he set it on the stove, where it sat in dignified stillness, awaiting heat. While the kettle began its slow ascent toward boiling, Elias stood by the counter and let his gaze drift. The morning light had shifted just enough to be noticed. Slightly warmer now, with a faint golden tint edging into its otherwise pale wash. The dust motes seemed to approve of this development, their movement becoming almost imperceptibly livelier, though still far from anything one could call energetic. He glanced toward the workbench. The invention caught this new light differently, the dull brass from earlier now showing the faintest suggestion of warmth. It wasn't quite a shine, more like the memory of one. Elias considered walking over to it, maybe even touching it, but found himself leaning back against the counter instead, arms loosely folded. There would be time for that, plenty of time. The kettle began to murmur, a low, bubbling sigh that filled the small space. Elias liked this stage better than the actual boil. There was something about the gentle prelude that felt more in keeping with the morning. The full boil always seemed slightly impatient, like a friend knocking before you've finished answering the previous knock. He prepared his mug with equal lack of urgency. The spoon dipped into the tin of tea leaves with a small crunch, the dry leaves rattling as they fell into the bottom of the mug. He did not measure so much as estimate, relying on the same imprecise intuition he had used for years. When the kettle finally gave a soft, sustained exhale, its version of readiness, he poured the water slowly, watching steam curl upward in delicate ribbons that twisted and vanished before they reached eye level. The tea leaves swirled, some rising, some sinking, each following its own small, private logic. Elias carried the mug to the workbench, but did not sit. Instead he stood behind the stool, letting the heat of the tea warm his hands as he looked at the invention again. The morning was still quiet outside, though a faint clatter somewhere down the street suggested that someone, somewhere, was beginning their day with considerably more energy than he intended to. He took his first sip with care, avoiding the chipped rim by habit. The tea was just hot enough to demand respect, but not so hot as to delay drinking. He let it settle in his mouth for a moment before swallowing, the warmth spreading slowly, deliberately, as though it too understood the pace of the day. The invention waited patiently in front of him. Elias suspected it would keep waiting, at least until the tea was gone, possibly longer. After all, there was still quite a lot of morning left to fill. Elias set the mug down on the workbench, just far enough from the invention to avoid any accidental disasters, but close enough that he could still feel the curl of steam against his knuckles. It left a faint circular mark on the wood, one of many, really, a soft ghost of heat that would fade without ceremony. He rested his palms lightly on the edge of the bench and leaned forward. The invention greeted him in its usual manner. Not at all. It sat there in quiet, unapologetic incompletion, a small collection of precisely shaped parts that were still reluctant to admit they belonged together. Brass, wood and steel, each with their own idea of how the morning ought to go. Elias reached for a small brass fitting, holding it up so the light could find it. The shift of angle changed its color from warm gold to something more like muted honey. He turned it slowly between his fingers, not so much inspecting it as letting it be seen. Every groove was familiar to him by now, but familiarity didn't stop him from looking again, the way one might reread a sentence in a book they already knew by heart. From somewhere outside, a faint echo of voices passed by, indistinct, muffled by the air like conversation overheard underwater. Elias waited for the sound to dissolve before setting the fitting down again, aligning it almost perfectly with the edge of the workbench. Almost. He picked up a narrow strip of sandpaper and gave the piece a single, slow pass, the fine grit making a sound like someone quietly turning a page. Then he stopped. Not because it was finished, but because the moment didn't require more than that. The rest of the invention remained exactly as it had been when he'd woken, several small sub-assemblies arranged in a loose constellation, each one patiently waiting for its turn. Elias's hand hovered over them, considering, then withdrew without touching anything further. There was a right time for every adjustment, and this, clearly, was not it. Instead, he sat on the stool and wrapped both hands around his tea again. The steam was gentler now, the temperature having dropped into the ideal range for absent-minded sipping. He took another slow drink, his gaze drifting not to the invention, but to the space just beyond it. A section of wall, where a single knot in the wood grain formed a shape that vaguely resembled an eye. He had noticed it before, but mornings like this made such small details seem temporarily important. The clock on the far wall ticked with its usual steady indifference, measuring a time that Elias wasn't particularly following. The morning was not a thing to be rushed through. It was to be allowed to expand, to stretch itself fully, before the day's demands began compressing it again. The invention would wait, it always did, and Elias, tea in hand, was in no hurry to disturb that arrangement. By the time Elias noticed the afternoon beginning, it had already been arriving for some time. The light through the high workshop windows had shifted almost imperceptibly, not brighter or dimmer exactly, just different. The cool, pale tone of morning had been quietly replaced by something warmer, the sort of light that makes wood look as though it has been polished even when it hasn't. He was still sitting at the workbench, though his posture had softened into something less like sitting, and more like leaning on the idea of sitting. The mug was empty, tipped slightly toward him, as though it too had been leaning in to listen to the stillness. The air felt different now. Not enough to warrant a change in clothing, but enough that he noticed the temperature's almost imperceptible rise. That faint thickness that suggests the sun has climbed a little higher, even if it is still out of sight. Somewhere beyond the walls, a bird called once, then again, with a pause between, as though debating whether to continue the conversation. Elias let his eyes wander across the workbench. The invention looked unchanged, though that was perhaps the point. It had a way of being present without insisting on itself, a silent companion to his thoughts. Several pieces remained in their carefully placed positions, the brass fitting from earlier still resting in its nearly perfect alignment. The sandpaper sat beside it, curled slightly at the edges, waiting for work that might or might not come. He thought briefly about lunch. Not seriously, just in that abstract way one might think about a distant city, acknowledging its existence without any immediate plans to go there. A loaf of bread sat on the small shelf near the stove, leaning against a jar of honey. Both seemed perfectly capable of waiting until he decided whether the idea of lunch was worth the effort of making it. A faint creak from the floorboards above suggested that the neighbor had begun moving about. Elias imagined them doing something efficient and productive, possibly in stark contrast to his own measured stillness. The thought amused him, though only slightly, like an inside joke between himself and the empty room. The light shifted again, this time more noticeably. It angled lower, catching the edge of a small brass screw on the bench, and sending a thin glint across the surface. The glint faded as quickly as it appeared, but Elias had already turned his head toward it, following its path, as if it might reveal something. It didn't, of course, but he stayed looking anyway, simply because there was no reason to stop. The afternoon continued its unhurried approach, like a guest who knew they were welcome to take the scenic route. From somewhere outside, there came a sound that was less a distinct noise and more a textured presence, the low hum of life carrying on just beyond the workshop walls. It might have been distant conversation, the shuffle of wheels over cobblestones, or perhaps the steady rhythm of someone sweeping a doorstep. Elias didn't lean closer to find out. The sound, whatever its source, was perfect in its lack of definition. He reached for a small square of cloth and began wiping the surface of the workbench in slow, absent arcs. It wasn't dusty enough to need it, in fact, it wasn't dusty at all, but the movement served its own quiet purpose. The cloth caught the afternoon light, its edges frayed into soft little threads that curled as they shifted under his hand. He paused mid-motion to watch one thread sway and settle, as though the cloth itself had taken a moment to breathe. The air held that faint, dry warmth that comes when sunlight lingers on wood for more than an hour. Elias could smell it now. The subtle, resinous scent of the bench mingled with the ghost of earlier tea. Somewhere in the background, the kettle sat cool and empty, a silent suggestion that another brew might not be an entirely unreasonable idea. But instead of moving toward it, he picked up a small wooden gear from the edge of the bench. It was lighter than it looked, its teeth smoothed and rounded, in a way that made them pleasant to run a thumb over. Elias rotated it slowly in his hand, tilting it toward the light so the shadows between its teeth deepened and softened in turn. The hum outside shifted, just barely. The sweeping, if that's what it had been, stopped. A door somewhere closed with a muffled thud, and then the world beyond returned to a less structured sound. The kind of vague, atmospheric noise that simply exists. Elias placed the gear back on the bench, almost exactly where it had been. He allowed himself the small luxury of leaning back in his chair until the front legs lifted a fraction of an inch, then set them down again with deliberate care, as if the sound might startle the invention into sudden completion. It didn't, naturally. By now, the light had settled into its afternoon tone fully, deeper, warmer, the sort of light that doesn't so much illuminate as it drapes itself over objects. The brass pieces on the bench gleamed more richly than they had in the morning, their reflections softer, almost reluctant. The wooden parts seemed to have drawn in the light, holding it in their grain the way old books seem to hold the scent of the places they've been. Elias found himself tracing the outline of the invention without touching it. His eyes moved from one piece to the next, following the imagined flow of assembly, in a way that felt both purposeful and entirely hypothetical. It was like rehearsing a conversation he might never have, a quiet mental choreography with no audience. The floor under his feet felt slightly warmer now, though perhaps it was just his imagination. He shifted his weight from one heel to the other, listening to the creak of the boards. Each groan seemed to happen in its own time, as if the wood itself was measuring the day in an entirely different way than the clock on the wall. He thought again about the bread and honey. This time the idea came with a faint pull of appetite, though still not enough to dislodge him from his seat. The bread, no doubt, would still be waiting later. Bread was dependable that way. Outside, a bird passed by the window in a quick flash of shadow, so brief it might have been a trick of the eye. Elias watched the empty patch of air where it had been, not in expectation of another, but simply because it was there. The stillness after movement always seemed worth noticing. The invention, for its part, remained perfectly still, but in the rich glow of late afternoon, it looked almost agreeable, as though it was aware of being admired, and, in its own mechanical way, didn't mind. Elias smiled faintly at the thought, then leaned forward, elbows on the bench to give it a longer look. He didn't pick up a tool, not yet. That was work for a different hour, or perhaps a different day entirely. For now, the warm quiet of the afternoon seemed like the better choice. And so he stayed, watching the invention watch him back, both of them entirely at ease with the pace of time. It began the way most endings do, so slowly that you couldn't really point to when it started. The sunlight, which had been draped so generously over the workshop all afternoon, seemed to gather itself in, as though it had decided to leave early but didn't want to be obvious about it. Its golden tone deepened into something more amber, more deliberate, the kind of light that doesn't just illuminate, but seems to remember what it's touching. Elias noticed first in the corners, where the shadows had grown longer, not in leaps but in small, almost polite stretches. A thin band of brightness on the floor had shifted just enough that it no longer reached the leg of the workbench. That sort of thing didn't happen in the middle of the day. Somewhere outside, the sound of distant voices had changed too. It wasn't that there were fewer of them, just that they had taken on a softer quality, the way people's voices sometimes do when they're speaking in the kitchen while a kettle boils, as though aware that the day itself is starting to listen in. Elias reached for a small brass cog from the far edge of the bench, though he didn't particularly need it. Its surface was warm to the touch, holding on to the afternoon heat in a way that felt oddly companionable. He turned it slowly between his fingers, feeling the fine ridges catch against his skin in that satisfying, almost imperceptible way. The air had changed as well. It was still warm, but there was now a faint undercurrent of coolness, a quiet reminder that night had every intention of arriving eventually, whether anyone invited it or not. He could almost smell it already, that crisp, leafy scent that seems to belong only to the hour before dusk. His chair gave a long, slow creak as he leaned back slightly, letting his eyes wander to the small square of window above the bench. The light through it looked thicker now, like honey left to settle. Dust motes drifted lazily in it, not really traveling anywhere, just floating as though the air had nowhere better to be. Somewhere beyond the walls, a cartwheel rolled over uneven stones, the sound carrying a rhythm so slow it could have been mistaken for part of the day's natural breathing. Elias listened without needing to place it. The specifics didn't matter. The tone of things was what mattered. He set the brass cog back exactly where it had been and let his fingers rest against the wood of the bench. It was still warm, but just enough less warm than before to make him aware of the difference. Small changes. Almost invisible ones. The kind of changes that, if you weren't looking for them, you might miss entirely. Though, of course, Elias had nothing but time to notice. And so he did. By now the workshop had taken on that particular shade of stillness reserved for the hours between afternoon and evening. A time that isn't quite one or the other, but lingers in the space between. It was the hour when shadows stopped pretending they were temporary, and settled in for the long stretch ahead. They pulled gently in the corners, spreading in quiet increments, as though they were careful not to disturb anything. Elias sat without moving for several minutes, his hands resting loosely in his lap, the weight of the day easing down into his shoulders. He could hear the faintest tapping sound from somewhere in the walls. Not urgent, not persistent, just the small noises old buildings make when the sun shifts its attention elsewhere. A sliver of sunlight still managed to reach the far edge of the workbench. It lit the rim of a small unused jar, making the glass glow as if it were quietly holding on to the last warmth of the day. Elias found himself watching it far longer than necessary, tracing with his eyes the tiny imperfections in the glass, little bubbles and faint ripples, as though the jar's surface carried a memory of how it had once been molten. The air felt heavier now, though not unpleasantly so, the way a wool blanket feels when it's been draped across your knees for just a little too long. There was the faintest smell of earth and stone, creeping in through the open window, as though the evening was already leaning against the doorframe, waiting for permission to come in. Outside, someone passed by humming, not a song Elias recognized, but something slow and tuneless, the sort of melody that sounds less like music and more like thought escaping in sound. The steps were unhurried, pausing once, then continuing, fading until there was only the steady, almost inaudible hum of the air itself. Elias turned his gaze back to the invention. It sat there as always, neither more complete nor less than it had been an hour before. Its quiet patience mirrored his own. A small fine brush lay beside it, clean, unused since morning. He reached for it without thinking, letting the bristles bend gently under his thumb, not so much checking their softness as simply acknowledging it. He thought briefly, very briefly, about whether to light the lamp yet. It was too soon, really. Lighting it now would feel like admitting the day had ended, and the day, in his view, still had something left to give, even if that something was simply another few moments of golden light, inching its way toward the far wall. And so he waited, still as the dust in the beam of sunlight, and the workshop, for its part, seemed happy to wait with him. The moment finally arrived, not with any dramatic sweep, but with the sort of inevitability that comes when you realize you've been listening to the same faint sound for so long you can no longer tell when it began. The sunlight slipped away, not all at once, just enough that Elias noticed the brass fittings on the workbench no longer caught its glow. They sat in a more muted light now, their edges duller, their surfaces reflecting the dim interior, instead of the sky outside. The room's colors deepened. The pale wood of the shelves turned a shade richer. The papers on the bench looked slightly yellowed, as though they'd aged in the last half hour. Even the dust seemed heavier now, drifting less, and settling more. From outside came the slow rhythm of evening work, a far-off gate closing, the scrape of something being dragged across stone, the soft thud of a latch. The wind carried with it the faint scent of smoke from a hearth somewhere nearby, mingling with the earlier smell of earth, so that the air felt both grounded and warmed. Elias reached for the lamp at last, his fingers curling around its base. He didn't light it yet. Instead, he sat holding it, the cool metal an anchor in the deepening dusk. The glass chimney reflected a faint image of his face, distorted and dim. He studied it for a while, though not out of vanity, more out of the idle curiosity that comes when you notice your own reflection in something unexpected. The shadows no longer clung to the corners alone. They had joined hands across the floor, flowing like ink over the boards. The space between objects felt narrower, not because the room had changed, but because the dark had quietly claimed more of it. Somewhere a bird gave a final, solitary call, not urgent, not warning, just a simple statement to no one in particular. Elias imagined it settling its feathers, finding a branch or a ledge, and letting its small body loosen into the certainty of night. He set the lamp down again, deciding to wait just a little longer before striking the match. There was a certain satisfaction in letting the last scraps of daylight fade on their own terms. And so he sat, not thinking about the invention or the hours ahead or even the day behind, but simply about the color of the air, which had become the kind of blue that is less a color and more a feeling. The day was over, though neither he nor the room seemed in any hurry to announce it. And so, for tonight at least, the day in Elias's workshop draws to a close. The air has settled into its nighttime quiet, the kind that makes even the smallest movements feel like they might echo. The invention sits where it always has, looking no more complete than it did yesterday, and perhaps no less either. Progress, after all, is a matter of perspective, and Elias seems perfectly happy to take the long view. Somewhere outside, the last of the footsteps fade, and the hum of the street gives way to the stillness that comes when the world has decided enough has happened for one day. Elias remains in his chair, his eyes tracing the dim outlines of shapes he knows by memory, letting the room soften around him. There will be other days, more afternoons that linger, more evenings that stretch out like a cat reluctant to move from a warm patch of sun. And yes, there will be more time with Elias, more quiet hours, more unnecessary observations about the way light behaves on different surfaces, more thoughts that wander so far off course they need a map to get back. But for now, the night belongs to rest. The invention will wait, the world will wait. And perhaps you too can set aside the work of the day, letting your thoughts drift into their own slow orbit. Until next time, when the story continues, and Elias will no doubt be exactly where we left him, just a little older, a little dustier, and no closer to explaining what exactly he's building.